see that? Do I need to make a full screen?
Looks good to me.
Okay.
Great.
So what I'd like to do is jump off of some research that I started with Dr. Stam in the research methods class, which is taking a look at the way that comic books in the 1940s as a media form were used as a way of American propaganda to build various forms of support for World War II. Everything from morale to things on the home front like scrap drives, recycling, rubber, to as well as the vilification of America's enemies during the war. So while they were used to build morale, they were also used to kind of stoke the fires against various cultures and ethnicities that were the U.S. was fighting against at the time. There's also an interesting component with that I'd like to get into that I came across, which is within these books back then, you had some, I guess it'd be contradictions, because you had the vilification of enemies, while at the same time you had stories that were talking about the need for unification in the U.S. Amongst all races, religions, ethnicities, for the good of winning the war. So there's some interesting aspects there too that I'd like to get into. But let me jump in here. The intended outcome that I would like is to, for those who either read the text portion or view the project portion, as I plan to do a kind of a half and half. At Dr. Khan's suggestion, I'm going to do partial paper and partial project. And that project is going to be to create a web presence, kind of almost like a digital, I don't know if you call it gallery, museum, to kind of take a lot of this original artwork and panels and covers and put them into a historical context the way you would in a museum gallery, with the information from the paper being put along with those images and divided up into various subcategories as we go along. The intended outcome is that I'd like to create a better understanding of how important these magazines played as a media form during World War II. There were very few, well, I don't want to say very few, but compared to today, entertainment and information choices came from, radio, films, newspapers, magazines, and on those magazine stands were comic books. And they were a media form that flew enough under the radar where publishers actually were approached by government agencies in order to use this new media form as a way to start influencing its readers on the side of the government during World War II, as opposed to its kind of, especially coming from the isolationist nature of the United States before we officially entered World War II. I'm going to take a look at some of the storytelling patterns in my research and how those storytelling patterns changed from pre-Pearl Harbor to afterwards. How that was reflective in the texts and images themselves, and kind of put into historical context, as I mentioned, the way that not only the U.S. but various other cultures were portrayed and why that was. To look at them blindly through a 21st century lens would probably cause many to take a step back, because certainly by any standards, many of them will be considered quite racist or stereotypical. So I'd kind of like to kind of put some context as to what was going on that kind of motivated these publishing choices. The questions that I'm looking at are, what caused these companies to kind of suddenly start advocating for the war and this sense of unity across the U.S. Amongst various ethnicities and races and religions, especially since it was a stark contrast to what was being published prior to that. I want to take a look at the heritage of many of the writers and artists in this, at the time, fledgling industry. Many of them were Jewish immigrants or had come from parents who were Jewish immigrants, and how that kind of may have played a role in some of the decisions that were made with these stories, art, and depictions. I mentioned government offices before, but to what extent the government played and how much of a hand they had in some of these decisions, and the way that the comic book publishing industry veered during this time. And again, looking at the racial contradictions between some of these stories, which were telling its readers, young and old, that no matter your religion, no matter your race, everyone needed to accept and tolerate each other and work together for the good of the war. But at the same time, you had comic book covers from sometimes the same company, sometimes the same magazines, with very stereotypical images of Japanese forces, let's say, with Superman. There's the famous one here on the bottom, or I should say infamous, of Superman slapping Hirohito with what by any standards would be considered a very racist statement. And as I mentioned, the way that I'd like to approach this is a mixture of both. I'd like to do both a paper, but I'd also like to do the web presence too as a supplement to the paper, or one would supplement the other, vice versa. The paper will give all the details, the context, the history, research to support what I'm talking about from various journals, articles, and books that have been written either on the time frame or the publishing industry itself, or propaganda. I will use that research, as I said, to kind of support it the way that placards in a museum would provide context in an exhibit, only this would be online. I plan to divide that up into various kind of subtopics on the website, whether those topics are drives for public service announcements, recycling, buying war bonds, a different section on the enemy vilification, racial unity contradictions, one on morale, and kind of make it accessible so that anyone searching for this, anyone else who may be looking into this topic, can easily find not only the images and visuals from the era, but have an easy way to find the subcategory of what they're looking for. And pardon me, I lost my mouse there for a second there. In terms of methodology, I think of the ones that we've spoken about, I think activity theory is probably the one that is most relevant to a project like this. Activity theory looks at questions like how individuals or a group take part in a particular activity. In this case, those groups would be the creators and publishers of these magazines, and then the readers that make up the audience that ingested them. The tools, in my mind, would be the media itself, the books, and how they were used as a tool of influence during this time period. Activity theory also looks at the relationships of those groups that are taking part in the activity. In this case, that would be the relationship between the publishers and the audience, as well as the culture as a whole, that almost in a circular fashion, influenced the publishers that created for the audience that was part of the larger culture. In terms of design theories, both looking at some of this, the original material, and as I go forward with the web presence idea, design theories that seemed the most relevant were closure, which discusses the way that we perceive individual elements as a single pattern. With comic books, it's sort of the way that panels are used to tell a story. Our minds, when it comes to closure, is filling in the gaps of what happens in between when we're looking at storytelling in this format. So, one example might be Superman flying out of a window in one panel. The reader does not need to see him flying through the sky through every moment of the skyline until they reach the next destination. A writer and an artist can tell that portion of the story with him leaping out of the window, and then in the next panel have him landing in his destination, in our minds, based on closure theory, fill in the gaps of what happened in between. Entry point. Especially when it comes to the original material, I thought was especially relevant because it talks about minimizing the barriers to engage someone with a visual or design. And in this case, we're looking, in the early 1940s, these magazines were available in drugstores and newsstands and were there amongst dozens and dozens of other magazines and other, pulp magazines and comics and Life magazine, many others. And the publishers knew that what needed to be on the cover needed to make it pop in order to register with those at the newsstand, to make them want to pick it up, read it, and buy it. That's why you see so many of the bright colors in the character designs of this era, as well as on many of these colors. You'll see a lot of bright yellows, a lot of bright reds, things that will grab the attention and jump out to those who were, saw just an array of newspapers and magazines on a newsstand at the time. When exposure effects, that is something that obviously plays a very big role because we're talking about a tool of American propaganda. And anytime you're talking about propaganda or marketing, exposure effects deals with the way that we tend to like something more the more we're exposed to it. So by repeating a message over and over, the more we're exposed to it, the more likely we are. Oh, I see a spelling error on there. The more likely we are to actually begin to actually like and accept the message of marketing or propaganda that we are being sold. And another design theory, obviously, is storytelling. Through everything from setting, characters, plot, mood, movement, that's all part of telling a story, and that engages an audience. The other propaganda aspect of things is woven into that story, but it's the storytelling itself that draws a reader in, lowers those defenses, and when our defenses are lowered, we're more susceptible to the messaging that we are receiving. In terms of what I'll be using for research, as I said, I began some of this research with Dr. Stam in a previous class. Obviously, for some of the visuals, I will be using original texts and comic magazines from the World War II era. Using a lot of academic journals and essays, as well as books that looked at everything from wartime literature to the comic industry itself to publishing of that era to just culture itself. I also have a couple of interviews that in preparation for this that I conducted with some writers and editors who worked for DC Comics, which is a primary focus of a lot of the visuals that I'll be working with. One of which worked with many of the folks who were working in the industry during World War II. So it's secondhand accounts, but it's kind of the closest I could get since many of the original publishers are deceased at this time. So other than records that I've been able to find with exchanges, getting a secondhand account was certainly helpful. That is all I have for my slides. I have other information, but I didn't want to bore anybody any more than I probably already have. So I'll certainly go on with any questions.
Dave, do you have any examples of what you're going to be working on or creating?
In terms of like the website presence, you mean?
Yeah, just something. Yeah,
I don't have a mock-up of the website itself. I do apologize about that. I have I don't know if I have it right now, but I have a lot of the research that I have begun, but I don't have the mock-up visual of the website itself. It's something I could certainly put together, and I apologize that I don't have it.
Well, no, that's okay. I just thought I'd ask, but I do think it's something you'll definitely want to share with Dr. Stam.
Sure.
To start getting feedback. Mm-hmm. I think everyone's a little more comfortable when they see what your product's going to
start to I'm trying to
like.
describe something without actually showing you. I understand that's probably.
Yeah. And I think it'll help you too. I mean, just to sort of give it a shot and realize, the sort of doability factor. I want to make sure it's something that's that is in your range to get done in the next 2 or 3 months.
Well, I can certainly. I'm certainly not opposed to immediately starting on a a framework or mock-up, and then showing it to you and Dr. Stam, and
Sure.
getting some feedback so that it can get rolling sooner rather than later. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, and I think the lit review is going to help when you start doing that too, because you'll see what's
Hmm.
out there. And as with most people, they know the lit review sort of goes in two directions. I mean, one is to look at this sort of storytelling and how this is done in general, and then the other is sort of the comic book period itself,
Hmm.
and that end of the lit review. So you sort of got two areas. And that's fine because they do relate in the sense that you're going to use the material you learn in the first part about World War II in comics to create uh, this storytelling. I don't know that we've even offered storytelling recently. You didn't happen to take that class. I don't think we've offered it recently. Let's see.
Um, was that was the digital narratives? I took
I think
digital
that's right.
narratives.
I think that's right. Yeah. So
Okay.
you did. You may want to. Is that where you learned about activity theory, or is that elsewhere? I mean,
I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember which class it was. I feel like it's something that's come up a few times.
okay.
Uh,
Well, it's just that it helps if you can connect a theory to a class because
okay.
that way that helps you get more out of it. Like, how did I use it? What was going on? Who was the teacher? And
Okay.
um, so that's the only reason I ask to sort of get you back into IDT classes and
Certainly.
get
Certainly.
out of it.
I'm taking notes. If I'm looking down, I don't want anybody to think I'm just
Okay.
blocking out. I'm taking notes here as we go.
Mhm.
Okay. All right.
No, you can look down all you want. The let's see. You may want to look at Kevin Volo's thesis.
Okay.
He used comic books to tell a story. VOLO, he was a graduate in our program. And what he wrote about was webcomic distribution, distribution methods, monetization, and niche markets. It was a different,
Mm-hmm.
concept. But he was examining what happens when it's time to distribute a web comic. As I recall, I'm looking at his thesis, but I think he developed a comic. I'm sort of going to open it up. I know you don't see it on the screen, but
Yeah, I think he was involved with or the colorist for a graphic novel called Meteor Men, if
Okay.
I'm remembering correctly.
yeah. Yeah, well, he teaches, yeah, and he does a lot with comics. He
Okay.
creates comics all the time. But yeah, yeah, he talks about how to provide references for other artists using comic books. So how do you, which actually could be useful for you as well. How do you
Okay.
actually show what, he does have examples of comic books and shows a little bit of how he displaying the proper copyright notices, citing the actual comic book the art is taken from. So that might help you as well.
Okay.
So I recommend you look at